Former FBI Director James Comey has been indicted on 2 criminal counts by a grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia. 2 people familiar with the matter tell MSNBC 1 count is obstruction and the 2nd count is false statements. Sources tell MSNBC that the grand jury rejected a 3rd count, which is unknown at this point, but we will effort to get you that information. Donald Trump's Justice Department had been rushing to indict Comey before Tuesday, because that's when the statute of limitations would have expired on a charge at the center of the administration's probe. Now, late last week, Eric Siebert resigned as U.S. Attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia for refusing to bring cases against both Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James. Just days ago, Donald Trump actually demanded that his attorney general prosecute his perceived political enemies, including Comey, as he raged online about the lack of criminal charges against them. Let's kick off tonight with the full team coverage. We are joined now by former DOJ Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Mary McCord. She co-hosts MSNBC's Main Justice podcast. I think they have a new episode after today. Also with us is former SDNY Criminal Division Deputy Chief, Christy Greenberg. She is the host of Courtside with Christy Greenberg on YouTube. Both are MSNBC legal analysts. And we are also joined by our own Ken Dilanian, MSNBC Justice and Intelligence correspondent. Ken has broke several stories on James Comey in the last week. Thank you all for being with us this evening.
Ken, let's start with you and give us the latest. We understand that there are 2 or 3 indictments that have been released at this point by the grand jury, and Pam Bondi has also got a statement. So get us up to speed on the latest here.
That's right, Michael. It's 1 indictment, 2 counts, as Simone said, making false statements and obstruction of justice. And you're absolutely right. The Attorney General of the United States has issued a statement on X. She doesn't name Comey, but she's clearly referring to this indictment. She says, I'm going to read it to you. No one is above the law. Today's indictment reflects this Department of Justice's commitment to holding those who abuse positions of power accountable for misleading the American people. We will follow the facts in this case. And that certainly implies that at least one of these counts is about the thing that we thought it was about, which is accusing James Comey of lying to Congress. And we believe it has to do with his testimony from 5 years ago in a Senate hearing about the FBI's Trump-Russia investigation. The statute of limitations for that charge was set to elapse on Tuesday, and so this office was rushing to make this charge. What this means is that prosecutors were able to convince 12 grand jurors in the Eastern District of Virginia that there was probable cause to believe that this crime had been committed, these crimes, by James Comey. And what's interesting about that, of course, is that as we reported last night, career prosecutors in that office wrote a memo to the U.S. attorney, newly sworn in U.S. attorney, arguing that this case should not be brought because not only did they think they could not get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt, they argued that there was not, in fact, probable cause to pursue this case. And so you had career prosecutors saying, don't do it. You also had the previous U.S. attorney, who is a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in this office, balking at going forward with this case, which is one of the reasons he was forced out of office last week. And Donald Trump installed one of his former defense lawyers, Lindsay Halligan, who is an insurance lawyer who's never been a prosecutor. We are told that she was in the room for at least part of the presentation today before the grand jury. And this grand jury is now charging James Comey with felonies. This is a serious matter for James Comey. We have not heard from him yet or his lawyers. And this has been a long time coming, and it's a situation where Donald Trump essentially called for this to happen, and now it has happened.
This is not the first time, though, Mary, that Donald Trump has called for this to happen. And in the past, there have been grown-ups in the room who said, you're not going to do this on my watch. Part of the problem is those grown-ups are no longer there. The fact that Halligan was willing to bring this before a grand jury, even with her own line prosecutor saying this does not meet the lowest bar, the lowest threshold for what we ordinarily put before a grand jury. She did it anyway. They come back with 2 charges. They didn't go for a third. What does that say to you?
Well, we don't know yet what that 3rd charge was. And so it's, I'd be speculating, of course. But what that means is they did not find that whatever evidence that the government presented to it was sufficient for probable cause that 3rd crime had been committed. I think the other remarkable thing here is that the timeline, Ken laid it out. You've got the U.S. attorney being forced out / fired, depending on who you believe, the U.S. attorney or Donald Trump, because he refused to go forward with this. We have then the just extraordinary social media post directing Attorney General Pam Bondi to move forward against Mr. Comey, as well as others, I'll note, Letitia James and Adam Schiff. And then you've got him inserting his own personal attorney with no prosecutorial experience into that office, just sworn in on Monday. And I had been wondering who would be willing to take that case into the grand jury, because if the prosecutors who wrote the memo to the attorney general said there's not sufficient evidence here to seek an indictment, those prosecutors certainly shouldn't have been going before a grand jury and seeking a grand indictment, a grand jury indictment. They need to be a little worried about their own ethical obligations.
I will note, since we have been on air, and I know you all saw, folks at home saw a screen that looked like a press conference was being set up. We are checking to see if we can expect a press conference or a statement tonight in Alexandria, Virginia, that is outside of the federal courthouse. We do have a statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office of the Eastern District of Virginia. I will just read a bit from it. It is underscored that Lindsay Halligan, U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, announced today that a federal grand jury returned an indictment charging former FBI Director James Comey with making a false statement and obstruction relating to his oral testimony before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee on September 30th, 2020. This is a quote from the U.S. Attorney. They write, "The charges as alleged in this case represent a breach of the public trust at an extraordinary level. The balance of power is a bedrock principle of our democracy, and it relies upon accountability and a forthright presentation of facts from executive leadership to congressional oversight." Christy Greenberg, that statement seems extraordinary to read from a political appointee who is now serving as the acting U.S. Attorney of the Eastern District of Virginia, for a president who has not lived up to the words that are written here in this statement. Your take on what we are now learning?
Well, Lindsay Hannigan took office on Monday, and she's bringing an indictment against a former FBI director on Thursday. An indictment, again, that career prosecutors in the office who actually are steeped in the facts, investigated for months, advised against. She clearly wouldn't have had time to have done any kind of independent investigation of her own. She's not developing her own facts, really being able to dig into the law. There's just simply not the time to have done that. So, it seems pretty clear to us that, she was somebody who Donald Trump spoke to and tapped her in when the U.S. attorney said, "I'm not going to go forward with this." And he said, she'll get moving on this. She's a tough prosecutor. How he would know that, I don't know, because she's never been a prosecutor before. It just reeks. You cannot view this as not being part of a larger picture, right? You have a comedian who makes a joke that Trump doesn't like, and then he tries to pull that show off the air. You have news outlets who publish stories that Trump doesn't like. He sues them for billions of dollars. You now have the people who have investigated Donald Trump, and he doesn't like that, so now he is charging them with crimes and threatening to lock them up. It is cancel culture on steroids. It is incredibly disheartening. It should make everyone really concerned about where things stand with the rule of law in this country.
Mary, there's so many aspects of this now as it starts to unfold, and we get reactions to it. We have a reaction from United States Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, who notes, "I've had my differences with James Comey in the past, but I can spot trumped-up charges a mile away. Trump said he'd go after him, then fired a superb ethical prosecutor when he refused to bring frivolous charges against those whom Trump perceived to be his enemies. Now he's installed yet another one of his personal lawyers as the interim U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of Virginia. This one, a Florida insurance lawyer with no prosecutorial experience and no connection to Virginia to do his bidding. The rule of law must prevail." That, from the senator in the state from which this is all unfolding, is a powerful recognition of the political as well as the legal consequences to what the president is doing here. How do you see this playing out now that the grand jury has done its deed? What's next? What should we see unfolding? Particularly given, as we've already noted, you've had former prosecutors and others inside the building say there's no case here.
That's right. So one thing I want to say, people might say, well, why did the grand jury indict if there was insufficient evidence? Prosecutors have an obligation to not even go to the grand jury unless they actually think they can ultimately prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Right. So that's, I think, what probably Eric Sieber was saying. We don't have that. Maybe there was enough that grand jurors said, probable cause, it's a pretty low standard. We will do it at least for 2 counts. But I think this whole timeline sets up on the legal side an almost immediate motion to dismiss this case for selective prosecution and potentially even vindictive prosecution. Because essentially, by prosecutors saying there isn't enough here, what they're doing is they're looking at prior cases charging these offenses. They're looking what courts have said is required and what the jury would have to find if they're saying this doesn't stack up. So when you go ahead and you charge, when it doesn't stack up, you are treating this person, James Comey, a political enemy differently than you would treat others. And that's selective prosecution. I think we're going to see that. And ultimately, someday, and it may not even have to be till the end of the Trump administration, there will probably be lawyers that have to speak for the decisions that they made in terms of their professional responsibility obligations.
And just to keep my lawyer's hat on for just a second, so that selective prosecution piece is augmented or buffeted by the fact that the president was tweeting out, do it, and go after him.
And maybe if Lindsay Halligan was actually a prosecutor and actually knew some law, she would have said, Mr. President, we're going to have a problem here.